My name is Debra Lampert-Rudman. I'm the Curator of Education and Public Programs at Morven Museum and Garden in Princeton, New Jersey. And we are happy to be here for our third year of Grand Homes and Gardens. And so I just want to do a little housekeeping for tonight. As I just mentioned, everyone please keep your video and your audio turned off because you're going to want to hear and see everything that our presenters have for you this evening. So I'm going to turn this over to our Executive Director, Jill Barry, for the welcome.
Thank you, Debbie. So welcome. I am Jill Barry, the Executive Director of Morven Museum and Garden. Thank you for joining us for the Grand Homes and Gardens series. This is our third year of the program, and normally we would be gathering for a glass of wine in the Stockton Education Center. But tonight we gather at home with our Lyndhurst approved cup of tea over Zoom. While we long to be together again, this format is allowing us to welcome a member from as far away as Tasmania and as close as walking distance on the Great Road. This series has become a beloved midwinter escape of armchair travel at its finest, whisking us away to breathtaking houses and lush gardens. This year's theme, The Woman of the House, melds well to Morven's story, with our own Annis, Helen, and many First Ladies having made significant impact on our history. It's a refreshing lens to look at some other notable homes. If you haven't signed up for the series, I hope you'll join us to learn all about them. I want to thank our sponsors, Baxter Construction, our series sponsor, and our lecture sponsor, Mrs. G. Longtime Morven supporter, and for the second year supporting the Grand Home series, Elizabeth Wislar is joining us tonight from Baxter Construction. Elizabeth?
Well, good evening and welcome to Morven's Grand Homes and Gardens series. My name is Elizabeth Wislar, and I'm representing Baxter Construction. And Baxter Construction has been supporting our community for almost 40 years. And we're also preserving history as we do that, which is two of our favorite things. I know this year is a little different, and we will be together soon, and I'm looking so forward to that. But first, I wanted to thank you. I wanted to thank you all for supporting Morven. It's because each and every one of you who's here tonight is helping this beautiful small museum shine bright. And I just wanted to thank you. So sit back in your chair and enjoy this spectacular talk. And remember, pinkies up.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was great. And thank you to Baxter. We are also very, very thrilled to have with us this evening a lecture series sponsor, and that is Debbie Schaefer of Mrs. G Appliances. So welcome, Debbie.
Hello, everybody. It's so nice to be here tonight. So again, I'm Debbie Schaefer. I'm the CEO of Mrs. G Appliances in Lawrence Township, New Jersey. I know some of you are not local. We've been in business for 86 years, 3 generations, and 3 generations owned by women. So a perfect tie-in to the theme that's going on tonight. So Mrs. G sells over 50 brands of appliances. And I'm actually sitting in my dining room, but with the magic of Zoom, you can see I'm transported into our showroom. We're actually closed. We close at 6 tonight. I'm transported into our showroom. I'm in the Sub-Zero Wolf Cove living kitchen, one of the many beautiful displays that we have in the showroom. Some of you who haven't heard of Cove, that's Sub-Zero's new dishwasher. One of the, people always ask, how does like Mrs. G be in business for 86 years? How do you do it? What's your secret sauce? And it is absolutely our relationship with the community, having the relationship with Morven. I live just around the corner. So I'm, being in Princeton and walking by this building all the time, it's just, the home is just absolutely magnificent and always kept in perfect condition. It's so great. You both do such a beautiful job here. And relationships with what I call industry partners. One of my great industry partners is Baxter. And we're doing, as we speak, a beautiful kitchen, Miele appliances right now. And I just can't wait to see that finished. And also Princeton University. Princeton University is a great supporter of the local businesses in town and in the area. And I so appreciate all their support for us. We've been working with them for quite a long time. I'm a civil engineer by education, University of Michigan. If there's anybody out there who's a Wolverine, go blue. And because of that, I'm absolutely in love with architecture and in love with interior design and even the history. There's such a connection to historic architecture and how the architects and interior designers, I'm sure there's many of you out there who are listening today, bringing all those historic details and bringing it into new construction today. So I know that Howard has so much to say. I'm so excited. And I did a little deep dive into Lyndhurst, and I heard about and read about the great laundry house that they have. I'm not sure he's going to have a picture, but maybe we can chat about it at the end of the discussion. So without further ado, I so appreciate everybody being here today. And if you're local, come and visit Mrs. G. It's a beautiful showroom. I'm very, very proud of it and proud to continue my grandmother's, who's the original Mrs. G, tradition of supporting the community. And I look forward to Howard's talk today. So wish I could meet everybody personally, but like I said, the door is always open at Mrs. G. Please come down and visit.
Thank you so much, Debbie. And you know what's interesting? Mrs. G is who we're going to hear about too tonight from Howard Czar, but it's a different Mrs. G. I mean, your Mrs. G would have loved Mrs. Gould.
Oh, absolutely.
So I'd like to introduce now our speaker for this evening, Howard Czar, who is with us from Lyndhurst in Tarrytown, and it is it is America's finest Gothic revival mansion. And he has some amazing rooms to show us, some amazing grounds to show us. And without further ado, I give you Howard Czar.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Debbie. I have to admit before I start that I am a former Princetonian, but I am old enough to remember that when I was there, Morven was still the governor's mansion. So I very much look forward to coming back at some point and seeing the wonderful things that you've done to create a really wonderful museum. So for everybody who's listening tonight, I'm just going to do a few things in our talk. I'm first going to discuss Lyndhurst Mansion and its interiors. Then I'll really turn to the landscape and the estate buildings. And finally, I'll end up with a discussion of the women who really made Lyndhurst what it was. And can we start with our first slide?
Yes, we can. Just one moment. And through magic, here we are.
Yep, and if we can just go to our very first slide, I'm going to give a word about our beverage this evening. So when Debbie first called me, I was a little bit of a curmudgeon about providing a beverage, and I tried to give every academic reason for not doing that. You know, we shouldn't be pigeonholing women today as the mistress of the house with a Roman punch or a syllabub, et cetera, et cetera. But part of the real reason is one of the challenges that we have is that the family that owned it the longest, Railroad Baron Jay Gould and his daughter Helen and his other daughter Anna, Jay was not a drinker and Helen was a teetotaler. What you're looking at here is a search result about an article in the San Francisco Call from 1913, which gives a front page story about Helen Gould's marriage. And in it, it says the wedding will have all the attractions except alcoholic drinks which its neighbors offered. So Helen was a very religious woman. She was a teetotaler. And so really the only thing we could recommend for this evening is tea. You would have made Helen very happy drinking tea. I assure you we will not check. If you're drinking a Long Island iced tea or some other equivalent, feel free to knock yourself out. But one of the things I would actually point out, one of the reasons that Lyndhurst is actually preserved as a mansion is, even though it's considered one of the most significant pieces of American architecture of the 19th century, that's not why it's preserved. It's preserved because Jay Gould was neither a drinker, a smoker, or a womanizer. Typically in the Gilded Age, houses like this, which were spring summer houses, the men stayed in the city while their wives and children went up to the country, and the men in the city did whatever it was they did. Jay Gould came home every evening on his yacht to his family, and because he was beloved, because he didn't smoke, drink, and womanize, his children preserved the house in his memory, and that's why we have this architectural gem today. So listen, everybody, try to be a good parent. Next slide, if we could, Debbie. So let me start with Lyndhurst, which you're seeing in front of you here. It's really considered one of the most seminal houses of the 19th century, definitely the most important Gothic revival, but really even more than that, one of the significant houses of the 19th century. It's the transition in the United States from classical architecture to romantic architecture, which is a fancy way of saying, if you know what a Sutter Hall colonial house looks like, square, hall down the middle, rooms to either side, that's your classical federal architecture. Lyndhurst is romantic, Victorian, more free form. It's the kind of architecture we still have today. It was designed by a gentleman named A.J. Davis, who was essentially America's first starchitect. He was really the Frank Lloyd Wright of the 19th century because he designed the outside, the inside, the furniture, placed the building in the landscape. So really very much like Frank Lloyd Wright later, 75 years after them. He did all these things with the architecture. And one of our architectural professors has said that Monticello, Lyndhurst, and Wright's Fallingwater are literally, of the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, the three seminal houses, not just because of their beauty, but because of the influence they have. People really build because of the breakthroughs that these structures have made. So it's a very important house. Next slide, please. Now, Lyndhurst was originally built between 1838 and 42, and you're looking at a watercolor of what the house originally looked like. And when it was done, it was the first fully realized Victorian house when Greek Revival style was still really in its heyday. So for those of you who don't know architecture, think Terra and the columns and all those southern mansions. That is Greek Revival style. And that style stayed dominant till literally about 1860, right up till the start of the Civil War. So when this was built as a very luxurious house, people thought the owners were just crazy. This would have been the equivalent of building a Frank Gehry house today at the same time. That's how radical it was. It was built along the Hudson Valley at a time when the near Hudson Valley was developing for estate villas. It was right next to Washington Irving's house. And these houses were being built in the 1830s and 40s because there had been a cholera epidemic in New York in the 1830s. Half of the population of New York escaped the cholera epidemic, and then people started building these Hudson Valley homes. So a little bit of what goes around comes around. The same thing has happened in the Hudson Valley because of COVID. The house was originally built by a former mayor of New York, but it was his wife's family that actually had the funds to allow this to be built. And also, Alexander Jackson Davis, who was the architect, was also a landscape architect. And we believe that the house has what was essentially Davis's only surviving landscape scheme on it. If we could go to the next slide, please. So between 1864 and 1868, Alexander Jackson Davis comes back for the second owner to double the size of the house. And so what you're looking at, if you remember that first slide, is really the house that you're seeing that exists today. And this is a copy of a watercolor rendering of the house and the floor plan at the front that exists in the Metropolitan Museum, which holds many of Davis's paper. Davis also designed, between the two schemes in 1838 and 1864, about 50 pieces of furniture for the house. which we have. And luckily, because the house was always sold as a furnished country house, we probably have close to 80 to 90% of the original furnishings that have always been in the house. One of the ways we know that is because starting in 1868, they start taking photographs of both the interior and the exterior landscape. So basically, when you go through the house today, every room that you're seeing is pretty much documented to one of the historic photographs. And we do have about 10,000 pieces in our collection, with many pieces added by Jay Gould and his descendants, who owned the house for the longest period of time, from about 1880 to 1961. And if we can have the next slide. So here what you're looking at is a postcard of Lyndhurst, and Lyndhurst was so well known that in the 19th century, stereo view cards were published, hand-colored photographs and postcards were published, just like the one that you're looking at. And as you can see, even though there were probably a few more foundation plannings than we allow today for proper maintenance of the property, Lyndhurst really very much looks as it did back then. And if I could have the next slide, please. And more importantly, we have all of the original 67 acres of the original property directly on the widest part of the lower Hudson Valley. So typically with historic houses, the collections get sold off multiple times. The land gets sold off and they're sitting on maybe an acre or two of the original plot. We literally have, it all. And in addition to Lyndhurst, which is really what we'll talk about most, there are 15 outbuildings as a total on the estate. And that includes a 4-part carriage house, 2 gate houses, a bowling alley, 2 caretakers' houses on the rivers. 1 unfortunately burned down, 1 survives, a laundry building, a dog kennel building, a children's playhouse, a swimming pool building, the frame of the massive greenhouse, and a greenhouse services building. So that's a lot of buildings in addition to just the mansion. And what's interesting, you can see that tower in the picture of the mansion. And from the tower, you can actually see Manhattan very clearly, which is less than 25 miles away. So if we can go to the next slide, we'll turn to the interiors of Lyndhurst. What I'm showing you is a very long shot of Lyndhurst's parlor decorated with the 1838 to 1842 furnishings. Basically, every room in Lyndhurst except this one is based on photographic evidence. This really predates the use of photographs for this purpose in the United States, but the room is decorated based on an 1850 death inventory with the Davis furniture that has always basically stayed in the house. So if you're looking, you can see some of the chairs in the back. We literally have in this room about 15 pieces of Davis furniture. Those little chairs that you're looking for, equivalents have sold for in excess of $100,000 in the past. And on the front table, the bowl, which is why I'm showing this picture from this angle, was one that was given to us by former gold medal figure skater Dick Button, who was a major collector of period American furniture and paintings. And it's from the Paulding family, the original owners of the estate. We have very little ephemera and objects belonging to them, and this is one of the ones that we have. Next slide, if we could, please. We also have all 3 parlor suites of the 3 major families that owned Lyndhurst. This is the suite from the second family. It's 1850s furniture that was brought up in the 1860s. Even though this was an extremely grand estate, what the families that owned it did, they brought up their old living room furniture from New York City to their country house. And so that's what we have here. You're basically also, if you see in the back, there's a huge sculpture by an Italian sculptor named Benzoni, whose studio was one of the major stops in the mid-19th century on the Italian Grand Tour. This piece was actually bought out of a Crystal Palace exhibition and given as a wedding gift to Mrs. Merritt. Now, the furniture that you're looking at, primarily designed by Meeks and we believe Baudouin, was given by the third owner, Railroad Baron Jay Gould, to his sister, And their descendants donated it back to us in the 1990s. Recently, we realized that one of the pieces that was broken and moldering in one of the attic spaces happened to be the sofa from this suite. What you're looking at the back of the picture is the love seat, not the sofa. And we have the sofa out now for restoration. And so except for one armchair, we have all the other 12 pieces of the suite. If we could go to our next slide, please. Now here what you're looking at is the suite designed for the suite designed by the Herder brothers, who were the main makers of furniture for the Gilded Age elite in New York and San Francisco from the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. This was furniture that was done in the 1860s from Jay Gould's New York house. The Herders came back, redesigned the parlor for Jay Gould, and added new pieces in the early 1880s. And this was probably the last commission of the two living Herder brothers. They sold the company, which went on, but this was their last major commission. And the next slide, please. This is Lyndhurst's Grand Picture Gallery, which is perhaps one of the premier interiors in the United States. This room dates from the original house. The paintings collection that you see here is about, I would say, roughly 2/3 of Jay Gould's collection of French and continental academic paintings from the 19th century. He bought most of his paintings from Knoedler, which is a gallery which existed till only a few years ago when they went bankrupt from selling counterfeit paintings in a scandal, but was the premier dealer for a very long period of time. He bought major paintings which are in this gallery, including pieces by Courbet, Gérôme. We have two Bouguereaus, Corot, and many of the Barbizon School landscape painters, as well as works by Louis Comfort Tiffany, which are both watercolors and other decorative objects. The window at the back is an early design by Louis Comfort Tiffany, done around 1882. Tiffany's family also lived in the same village during the summer. They went to the same Presbyterian church as the Goulds, and the Goulds knew them as family members. Helen Gould refers to Louis Comfort Tiffany as the younger Tiffany, because his father, Charles Tiffany, was the founder of Tiffany and Company, and he was the older Tiffany. So they knew him personally. Next slide, please. Here you also get a view from the top of the Grand Picture Gallery. This is from what's known as the Minstrels Gallery. So when this was used for musical parties and balls, the minstrels or the musicians would have played in this gallery up top. People would have been down below where they would have danced. Let's go to the next slide. Now, this is another of the major seminal rooms at Lyndhurst. This is the wonderful dining room. When Lyndhurst is doubled in size in the 1860s, just at the end of the Civil War, most of what's added is actually functional space. Kitchens down below are expanded. Some bedrooms up above are expanded. Servant spaces are expanded. There are not a lot of main rooms added on the ground floor. And this is really the most important of the rooms that was added. And in many ways, you can say that if you wanted to know what wealth looked like in the North after the Civil War, when the wealth in the United States moved from the South to the North, this is an excellent example. The room is almost complete. The lighting fixtures are later when the house was electrified. Everything else is from the 1860s. And there's a lot of faux work. Except for the mantelpiece, a lot of what looks like marble columns is all faux painted wood. A lot of what looks like carved oak is faux painted pine. The wallpaper, which is supposed to be faux leather, is also flocked and painted and hand gilded. And a lot of people think that this faux work was done because it was cheaper than buying the real things. It was actually more expensive because a marble installer was essentially a blue-collar worker. A faux painter was a higher level, was an artist, and it showed you both your wealth and your taste. And it's really a wonderful room. Next slide, please. As I've said before, we have photographic evidence starting from the 1860s of what all the rooms look like. And this is a photograph of the main bedroom that is upstairs. This was known as the state bedroom, a term taken from British homes. This was the largest bedroom, and it was basically intended for the wife of the owner, who might have used it both as a bedroom, as a nursery if she had young children, and also as an office where she would have met with the cook, the servants, the footmen to instruct them on what they needed to do during the day or the week. Interestingly, when Helen Gould buys the house out of the estate in 1894, she doesn't move into this bedroom. She moves into the smaller bedroom, usually reserved for the gentleman of the house, because that's the owner's bedroom. Remember, master is a current term that is going away. Typically in those days, it would have been the owner's bedroom. She was the owner. So even though she was no longer a man as an owner, she went and slept where the owner slept. Now, let's go to the next slide, please. So this will show you, just as you saw that picture before, you can see that basically the rooms in the house are decorated with the furnishings and to look like what you see in the photographs. Now, let's go to the next slide and turn to discussing Lyndhurst landscape and the estate buildings. Now, this map was originally done in 1870, published in 1873. And one of the things that's useful for it, I know it's hard to see on the screen, but you can see areas where trees are marked in, and some of them are much darker and thicker. And then there's a lot of what looks like little dots all over the landscape. Well, this map is topographical, but it's a representative watercolor of the estate. And what they've done, and what is useful to us, is they've made the trees that were mature at the time that this was done in 1870. They've painted them in much larger, and the trees that were planted between 1864 and 1868 are much, much smaller. So that allows us to actually know what Alexander Jackson Davis planted and indicated in the original design of Lyndhurst in the 1840s. And one of the things you'll notice is there's a really big screen of very mature trees along the riverfront. Well, part of that is because the New York Central Railroad went through in the 1840s. Washington Irving was devastated. It cut off the little cove for his boat right next to his house. And what we believe they did in Lyndhurst, where they were a little more wealthy, they were able to actually raise up the land above the railroad, plant a screen of trees, and that's how they hid the railroad. So you don't actually see the tracks being redone. One of the other things, let's stay on that landscape slide for just a moment if we can. One of the other things that's interesting is that Lyndhurst landscape was never actually fully redone. People added to it, but basically what you see here is the structure of much of what you see when you come to Lyndhurst today. Things got added, they rarely got subtracted. And generally, if I had to typify the landscape, it is in what's known as picturesque to garden-esque style. It is largely made up of trees and shrubs with selective floral plantings, and a lot of it was particularly influenced by the building of Central Park in the 1850s and 60s. So let's go to the next slide now and take a look at some of the specific aspects. So we're looking at a group of fountains and marble seat furniture that is in front of the Lyndhurst mansion. This was restored about 2 years ago. It was originally put in by Helen Gould, the fourth owner in the 1890s, when having marble sculpture from Italy becomes the rage on all these Gilded Age estates. The fountain that you're looking at is by the American sculptor working in Paris, Frederick McMonnies. It's known as Boy with Duck. Another model is at the Metropolitan Museum in their sculpture court. It was originally a fountain called Pan of Rohalion. There were two on the estate in the 48-inch size. Unfortunately, they were both sold. We have not been able to find one of those. So we got another fountain by Frederick McMonnies to go in his place. All these pieces that you see here were taken off the estate in the 70s because they were not viewed as original to the estate. They were moldering in the greenhouse basement. We were able to look at period photos, match them up with the pieces, restore them, and put them back in place. One of the reasons we wanted to do that is because we realized that the last two owners, and we'll talk about this more, the women who owned Lyndhurst, and this is true of many houses, women have really been the ones who have often preserved these houses and really given them to the public for public use. And so we're trying to make that presence of the influence of women more visible throughout the estate. Next slide, please. Another building on the estate was one that was built by Helen Gould in 1894. It's a bowling alley. This building was completely derelict until 4 years ago. It had really fallen into disrepair. The building was one that was built by Helen Gould because men and women could bowl equally together. It was one of those few sports where a woman wouldn't compromise her virtue or have to be seen in bloomers by a man. So it was important to her to have this equality on the estate. Also, one side of the bowling alley was reserved for sewing school to teach women first your servants and then in the community to give them economic equality and a possible trade to make their own money separate from their husbands. So this is what it looked like in the past, fell apart. And if we can go to the next slide. This is what it looks like today restored on the exterior. And the next slide, please. This is what it looks like on the interior at the lanes. And interestingly, when these lanes were initially built, it was the first regulation bowling alley lane installed in the United States. Helen builds this right before New York and Chicago bowlers meet at an annual conference to set the modern regulations, which still exist today. You'll see, even though we have the original wood pins and wood balls, we use modern pins and balls because you can. It's a perfectly regulated lane. You can bowl a game, and if you're a great bowler, you can actually bowl a perfect game on these lanes. The one thing I would point out is when Helen Gould tried to buy the lanes originally, the vendor didn't want to sell it to her. He felt that a woman would be too flighty to complete the transaction. She had to have a man purchase it on her behalf anonymously. So that gives you a little sense of how times have changed. And I think our two sponsors this evening can quite speak to that and testify to that. Next slide, please. Another of the Helen Gould additions is one of the few areas of floral decoration on the estate. It's the rose garden that was added around World War I. Originally, all the roses were in shades of pink from a pinkish white blush, almost to a rose. And those were the only colors. The rose trellises survived. The Temple of Love in the middle is actually placed there by Helen's younger sister a little bit later. It's a really beautiful state. But one of the things that I would say is Helen was a very serious horticulturalist, naturalist, birder, and animal lover. Her father grew up in the Northern Catskills, which is where they had their high summer retreat. And he went to grade school with John Burroughs, who was a noted naturalist at that time. So Helen wasn't just a lady, sort of rose garden club gardener. She really took this very seriously. And everybody who came to visit for the first time was given a book on American botany and species. Next slide, please. One thing that was directly across from these rose parterres were rectangular perennial beds and this fountain. This is a fountain that was copied from the Beauboulis Gardens showing Diana and the elders. We only have about half of the fountain at the moment. A number of years ago, we found a colored film from 1942 before the estate really started falling into disrepair that showed the exterior landscape in all its colors. So we have a lot of black and white photos like this, but we now know the exact colors that the flowers bloomed in. And we're looking probably in a few years to start the process of restoring the fountain, the marble seat furniture in this area, the columns, and the flowers that were there. Next slide, please. One of the things about this estate was it was used heavily during World War II for convalescence for soldiers. And here we have a lovely picture of a soldier showing his respects to Diana in her state of undress. Next slide. As I said, many parts of the estate were heavily influenced by the building of Central Park in the 1850s and 60s, which was being finished in the 1860s when the landscape was being expanded. This is a photograph of one of those lovely seating areas with cement sidewalks surrounded by rocks, and a wood bench. And if you look very closely at the right side of the bench, you can see a very ghostly image of the photographer sitting there timing with his stopwatch in the photograph, with one of those big box cameras as he's timing. So if you go to the next slide, when I got here about 8 years ago, this is really what was remaining. The rocks were actually all in place. The concrete had been ripped out because people didn't realize concrete was a luxury material in the 1860s. They thought it was a later addition. And so the dirt paths between the stones stayed, and we could actually match up the stones with each of the pictures we had. So if you go to the next slide, this is now what Lyndhurst, this lower landscape restoration looks like today. Clearly the trees haven't grown in and we have more plantings to do. But it basically, if you remember that first photo, it really looks very much like what it did in the 1860s, and we've been able to do this restoration. And if you can keep going to the next slide, please. This is the swimming pool building that Helen Gould also built around World War I. That's what it looked like today, and it fell into complete disrepair. And if we could go to the next slide. This is what it looks like today. We're starting a long-term refurbishment, putting back the landscaping around it and really trying to slowly redo the interiors. Our next slide. This gives you a sense of how sumptuous it was, and you can see here the lifeguard is in a boat in the pool on the inside. If you watch any of the Dark Shadows movies from 1970 to 71, you'll actually see this building in relatively good shape still. Now let's go to the last part of our lecture this evening and talk about the women of Lyndhurst. So what I'm showing here is the people who were the owners of Lyndhurst. It was 3 families, 5 owners. Originally built by William Paulding, a former mayor of New York in 1838 to 1842. Dies relatively young. It's then sold in 1864 to George Merritt, who then dies fairly soon after in the early 1870s. His wife then holds on to it. She rents it to the Goulds at the end of the 1870s, and they buy it in 1880. Jay Gould is a relatively sickly man. He dies in 1893. His eldest daughter, Helen, buys the house out of the estate in 1894. She lives there the longest, does the most to it. She lives there till about 1938. And then her youngest sister, Anna Gould, Duchess of Talleyrand-Perigord, flees France in 1939 in advance of the Nazis, and she purchases it then. She holds it till 1961, when it's donated to the National Trust for Historic Preservation as a monument to her father and her sister, and it takes a while in receivership. The National Trust gets it in 1965, and shortly thereafter it's opened as a museum. But let's look at the women specifically, of which you've already seen 2. Unfortunately, we don't have a picture, as much as we've looked, of William Paulding's wife, Maria Rheinlander, but we have pictures of the other women. So you're seeing a portrait of Julia Merritt, which was actually just donated back to us last year, a portrait of Helen Gould Sr., Jay Gould's wife, and Helen Gould and Anna Gould, who you've already seen. And in many ways, one of the things that's interesting about Lyndhurst is oftentimes women really do rule the roost at Lyndhurst. And so let's talk about a few of them with the next slide. Let's go to Maria Rheinlander first. She is a sign of one of the old Dutch families that rules New York City socially. If you've ever read Edith Wharton, particularly Age of Innocence, it's all about those Dutch families whose social prognostications are incontrovertible and must be listened to by all. One of the things people don't realize is the fortunes of those Dutch families came from early involvement in the triangle trade. So although many of them, but not all, I would stress, were not specifically involved in the sale of slaves, there was enslavement in New York, and the Dutch were known to be enslavers. Their money came from owning those ships. And in a twist of convention at Lyndhurst, it's Maria Rhinelander's money that allows the funds for the building, and the husband and son who designed the mansion. And one of the reasons in many ways that Lyndhurst is built in Gothic style, Gothic is often considered a male style, which is often reserved for the men's library. But since they're designing rather than funding, they actually design it in a Gothic style. Let's go to our next slide and talk about Julia Merritt. I will just say for those of you who know Connecticut, these are not the Parkway Merritts. The Merritts are the least known of the people who owned Lyndhurst historically. Her husband develops and owns a patent for the spring and the passenger seats of railroad cars at a time when railroad expansion was the equivalent of technology expansion today, and that's where the big fortunes were made. So he buys Lyndhurst in 1864, redecorates, re-landscape. They move in 1868. He dies 1873, and she actually is the one who has to manage the estate, figure out its sale for 7 years. So she's really the one for a very long time who has to run the place. Let's go to Mrs. J. Gould. I would say she's the exception in this rule. She is definitely a supporting player in the J. Gould Railroad Baron show. She comes from a very nice upper middle class family. She's domestic, she's religious, like an upper middle class rather than perhaps an estate owner. She keeps the household accounts, writes down how much was spent on vegetables every week. And when you're in the house, we have this portrait of her, which is a watercolor, not particularly large portrait. We've got two massive portraits of Jay Gould, only one of her, and that tells us a lot about where she sat next to Jay. Not so for her daughters. If we go to Helen, who's next. Helen is the eldest daughter of Jay Gould, and in very many ways, she was a very modern woman. And what is interesting about the Goulds is not how perfect or wonderful they are as people, but in many ways, they are harbingers of how we actually choose to live today. And their money allows them to do that. If we can keep on that last slide, please. Helen is described by one of the newspapers as being plain, plump, and not interested in society. And I think she would agree with that. She saw that as frivolous. She was essentially, she was trained at NYU Law School, did not get a degree because in those days women could attend courses, but they didn't get a degree because you couldn't have a job. She doesn't marry till she's 43 and basically says that if she had married earlier, she would have not been able to see and do the things that she had done, a very modern sentiment. And basically in those days, if you didn't get married when you were 18, that was it. It was very unusual for somebody to get married when she was 43. Her father was notorious on Wall Street. He was not accepted in society. And she becomes one of the best known philanthropists in the United States and essentially repairs his reputation. And I would say she was a very astute person. And although in many ways a very traditional and deferential woman, she was by no means a pushover. Let's go to her sister, or sorry, to talk about her more. Helen Gould is also a very astute collector. She has a great eye for quality, even though she's a proper church lady and does nothing in excess. She buys selectively and always buys the top of the line. And even though it's not as well known today, she was a significant collector and commissioner of works by Louis Comfort Tiffany. Let's go to the next slide. This is a dress of hers from when she turned 18, which was selected by her parents. And you can see how decorative and flouncy it was. She could probably barely move. She could look good, but not do a lot more. It was designed by a lady named Mrs. Conley, who was known as the Irish sensation. And she was if you weren't going to Paris to buy your dresses, she was the person in New York who made them for you. Let's go to the next slide. This is Helen when she's able to buy her own clothing. This is a dress by the French maker Redfern. For those of you who know fashion, Redfern falls between the Worse at the end of the 19th century and Chanel in the 20s. Redfern actually introduced sportswear, and he was British, and he introduced men's tailoring. So this may not look it, but this is much more men's tailoring, less designed, high quality, neutral, good for business, good for meeting people, good for all kinds of things, in many ways, very modern. Next slide, please. This is an example of Helen Gould's Tiffany purchase for her Fifth Avenue mansion. This is an 11-foot window. It's considered Tiffany's best scenic window, and it's in a collection in San Francisco today. Next slide, please. These are also Helen Gould purchases. On the left, Tiffany's best known glass vase of fish swimming in water, which sold about 10 years ago for $500,000, which we do not own. And the one on the right, which we do, a Tiffany enameled vase, incredibly rare and in our collection. And the next slide, please. This is a watercolor of a commission that Helen does to commemorate her father in a church in Roxbury, New York, way upstate in the Catskills, where he was from originally. And the next slide, please. And this, just to give you a sense, is what those windows look like. They're some of the earliest ecclesiastical windows by the designer Wilson, who makes the windows that look the way we do windows today. And the next slide, please. This is a library in Irvington that Helen Gould commissions from Tiffany, which was recently restored and is still there today. And our next slide. This is the NYU Library in the Bronx, which Helen again pays for and commissions. It's by McKean White and is considered Stanford White's finest building. And she also brings in Tiffany to do the interiors. Now let's talk about Helen's youngest sister, Anna Gould, who marries, she's the youngest daughter. She marries two French aristocrats, including the Duke of Talleyrand. She divorces her first husband, throws him out when she finds out that he's fooling around, but she keeps the fortune and her independence. She returns to the United States and to Tarrytown, where she was known as the Duchess of Tarrytown, and tries to recreate her French lifestyle. She was a very willful and individualistic person. But again, I think she's much more indicative of the way women today live and are able to much more course their own lives. She lives most of her life as a French duchess, gets accustomed to Luke's life. Her first husband was a major collector and the prototype for the Duc de Guermantes and Proust. So she buys a lot of luxury goods in Paris. And when she moves to New York in advance of the Nazis in 1939, she tries to reestablish her life here. I would say in many ways, though, she's a little bit of a shopper. It's not necessarily quantity. It's, it's more quantity than quality. And you'll see this in our next slide. So this is what Lyndhurst looked when she lived there. And you can see a lot of her French purchases and the chinoiserie that she adds. And you basically couldn't live in these rooms. They end up being repositories for the stuff that she buys. Next slide, please. When she moved to Paris, she was only 18, and she literally, the French just considered her a horrible American bumpkin. What you're seeing here is the watch she commissions from Tiffany & Company as a wedding present for her husband, which we bought about 3 years ago. It's his coat of arms on the outside and her wedding picture engraved on the inside. She was not considered chic by the French at the time. And she really she looked at them like, look, I could buy the whole pack of you together, as Americans could. But it took them a while to accept her. And the next slide, please. So here you see some of her high-end shopping. She learned very easily to shop at Van Cleef & Arpels and at Cartier, and these are some of the pieces that were made by them. The one on the left is a little flapper clutch by Cartier, which is in our collection currently. And the next slide, please. This is a painting by the French artist Bouguereau, and Bouguereau paintings in the United States were the indicator in the 19th century of wealth. We have two. This is one she bought. It's a very late Bouguereau at the end of her life, but it's one of those things she tried to buy to make the mansion look more French. And the next slide. This is a flapper dress from the 1920s that we just recently reacquired that she wore. Interestingly, even though Anna was quite short and relatively pear-shaped, she really liked to dress in a very feminine way. And this is a dress that she was wearing when she was close to 50. So let's go to our last slide of the evening. And this is one thing that in retrospect, I think is very useful to discuss. Why don't we actually remember these women? Why don't we talk about these women, in particular the Gould women? Because Helen Gould was a leading philanthropist in front page news. As I showed you at the beginning, her wedding was on the front page of newspapers all across the country. Anna Gould was one of the leading socialites in New York and one of the wealthiest women in the world. Even though Jay Gould is not as famous today as maybe some of his peers like Carnegie and Rockefeller, he's still a little better known and has a little more of a reputation, whether good or bad. But the women are really largely forgotten. And I think there are a few reasons for this. There's specific reasons. One of them is that the social stigma of Jay Gould, he was really seen as the top, but a notorious financier on Wall Street. He wasn't in society. So there was a lot of social stigma against him. And unlike the Rockefeller family, which is still very united today, for example, the children of Jay Gould didn't really associate as a unit. So it was easy to forget them. The fortune only lasted for 2 generations, so the philanthropy is not fresh today. And in their time, they were not status seekers with their philanthropy. And as a result, a lot of institutions bearing the names of the Gilded Age elite of the 19th century, Brown University, Duke University, the Whitney Museum of Art, the Goulds didn't do that. Basically, New York University was the university they supported extensively, didn't ask for it to be named after them. So in many ways, the family disappeared as a known quantity, I think, in the United States, and that often still impacts the reputation of the women a little more than it does the men. So I hope you found this interesting this evening, that I didn't go on for too long. And Debbie, I believe at this point, if you'd like, I'm happy to be here and answer questions that people might have.
Thank you thank you so much. This was amazing. And we do have questions in the chat, and I have some questions that I received earlier, but I would appreciate if everyone would still stay muted unless you're asked to be unmuted, because it would just, make it so much easier for everyone to hear. So first question I have here is, so who did Helen marry?
Helen married a gentleman named Finley Shepard, who worked for her father's railroad. And it's actually, it's an interesting love match. She married for love. One of the reasons Jay Gould was loved by his children is he didn't force them to marry when they didn't want to, and to marry anyone who they didn't want to. They didn't force socially acceptable marriages, which, if you were Vanderbilt or Astor, was much more the case. Helen meets her husband in a train wreck. She's on a train outside of Chicago in Indiana. And she goes around, much to the consternation of her older brother, who's running the Gould businesses, to keep track of the business interests. Train crashes. She had nurse training, I believe, from World War I, or just generally from being in the Red Cross. And she goes out to administer, and Finley is sent to find her because they don't know where she is. They think she might have been thrown from the train. He sees her, they meet in that, they get to know each other, and that's how they meet and get married.
Well, that's of course, you want to meet in a train wreck.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, I wondered because, she was 43, and that, like you said, it was so old. So that's a great question somebody sent. The other question I have here is, why was it called Lyndhurst? There's no one named Lyndhurst in this group.
Yes, so there's a few things. The property goes through 3 different names. The original owners call it Knoll because it's a house set up on a rocky knoll overlooking the Hudson River, getting the breezes that rush up from below. The second owner called it Lindenhurst because, if you remember, a lot of the landscape was expanded among the second owner, including many linden trees that were placed on the property. So that was the name. And then when Jay Gould purchased it, they just shortened it to Lyndhurst.
Oh, so it's about the trees then.
Yes.
Okay, let me see here. There's something that just popped into the chat. Someone asking, could we see the Rhineland slide again? Rhineland slide. And I would like to know why Jay Gould was so notorious.
There's a number of reasons with Jay Gould. He was really what you would call the first main Wall Street guy. In the middle of the 19th century, most people made their fortunes in railroads, owning railroads or building businesses or manufacturing. Jay Gould realized there was more risk in owning a business than in lending to the business owners, and he becomes a major stock manipulator. What most people don't realize today is that most of the things that are considered illegal in the market only happened after the Depression under Franklin Roosevelt. When Joseph Kennedy was appointed the first commissioner of the Securities and Exchange Commission, it was done because he was the dirtiest dealing person on Wall Street. He knew all the dirty tricks. And he basically came in to regulate and get rid of all those dirty dealings. But basically, until the early 30s, it was buyer beware on Wall Street, and Jay Gould was the absolute best at that. He ruined many prominent families. And the rule, again, if you go back to Age of Innocence, watch the movie, read the book, if you know, in that book, one of the things that happens is, as a financier, if you ruined other people, especially your peers, the social code was that you were supposed to completely disappear from society and never be seen or spoken to again and not make money. Well, that wasn't Jay Gould. And he angered and had sharp elbows with the two leading families of the time, the Vanderbilts and the Astors. They didn't receive him into society. The minute he passes away, his children are accepted into society. But that's why. An interesting aside on that, he was often accused of anti-Semitism, even though he was Presbyterian and not Jewish. People thought with his last name, his short stature, and his beard, he was racially profiled as being Jewish, and because he was so good on Wall Street, that was also done improperly. And Jay Gould often said that if they want to do that, that's their mistake. If they're scared of me for supposedly religious and racial reasons, I'm not going to dissuade them of that idea. But one of the things that's notable about Jay Gould, he was actually very close friends with his Jewish banking partners, which was really not allowed at the time. So he's an interesting character in that way. He's hated, but he really does some things that are really very interesting. Treats his daughters very well. He was friendly with people of other religions. He was very philanthropic, but he got in the way of the people who mattered socially.
Another question just popped up about Jay Gould while we're on the topic. The question is, was it Jay Gould that owned an estate in Lakewood, New Jersey that later became Georgian Court College?
Not Jay, his eldest son, George.
Oh, so it is the family.
So George, and my sense is a lot of Georgian Court is still there. And it's a very impressive estate. What happened was, talking about Jay Gould, the father not being socially acceptable. Well, the kids definitely wanted to be socially acceptable. And George's first wife was an actress, which in the 19th century was not originally acceptable and became more acceptable over time. She really wanted to be part of society. And the way she got in was when her younger sister-in-law, Anna Gould, was her first marriage to Count Boni de Castellan was in New York. That's what jettisoned them into society. They built a huge house on Upper Fifth Avenue. They built Georgian Court, and that's really what made them social. And that building's still there.
And someone posted, actually our horticulturist at Morven posted, yes, Georgian Court is still there with fabulous gardens. It is a college now. So yeah, it's college. And that leads to another question. Were there any famous garden designers at Lyndhurst?
Not, well, again, it's a little bit of a conundrum. The A.J. Davis, who's the architect, designed the earliest pieces of it. He is not famous as a landscape designer. He worked extensively with Andrew Jackson Downing, who hired Olmsted and Vaux. And Downing was the preeminent landscape designer of the time. He dies in a steamboat accident very young, and Olmsted and Vaux go on to take on his commissions and design Central Park. So Davis is well known. The guy who has most impact is somebody that is hired by the second owner and stays through Helen Gould, a gentleman named Ferdinand Mangold, who comes from Germany, from the state of Prince Ludwig of Bavaria. What a lot of people don't realize is, even though a lot of the design tradition is English, a lot of the horticultural tradition is also Germanic and Central European. And there are a lot of German, Swiss, Danish landscape architects up and down the Hudson Valley, because at that point, Germany is the intellectual academic country, and horticulture is a serious science. Many plants and genuses are identified in the 19th century. So having a German horticulturalist, they're largely forgotten today, but he was a big deal at that time. And as a result, Lyndhurst has a lot of groves of plant species. It really is a 19th century collection of trees that is due to Mangold.
Interesting. Thank you. So another question popped up. Is there a good definitive biography of Jay Gould?
There is. Unfortunately, I don't remember the name of it at the moment. I would literally say, online searches are our best friends, but you can find it. It's in paperback edition. There is also, which is harder to find, there is a DVD that was done about him. And you can also oftentimes find reference to him in books on the other Gilded Age financial elite, because he's a very important financial figure at the time.
So another question came up now. Could you explain what Germanic style of landscaping is?
Well, again, it's not so much about the style. It's it's a very important educational country, and it's more about the fact that botany is an academic study. So a lot of the style might have come from the English gardenesque to picturesque styles, which were pervasive through a lot of Europe in the 18th and 19th century. But it is the knowledge of plant species, plant collecting, that the Germans were really very advanced at, and that Mangold displays in the fact that Lyndhurst has very large clumps of different tree species, and the way the clumps are organized, especially along the entry drive, which you would either have walked through or gone through very slowly, either by horse and carriage or on a horse. You go from leaves of different shapes, leaves of different colors, trees of different shapes, trees of different structure, and it's like a constant unfolding TV show of trees.
TV show of trees. You mentioned the Age of Innocence earlier as tied in with this family. You gave a preview for a future Grand Homes and Gardens. We have Edith Wharton's home as our finale, and you're our kickoff, but you mentioned it, so that's very interesting. The question came up, is Lyndhurst open to the public in 2021?
So as everything, the answer is probably. Lyndhurst is open, the exterior is open, and the landscape is spectacular. It's a really great place to visit. We are accessible on foot through the Old Croton Aqueduct, which runs through the middle of Lyndhurst, as well as the Westchester River Walk. Starting in May, we are open again for vehicular traffic. And even if the mansion isn't open, it's really worthwhile to walk the buildings. We also have landscape tours that we specifically do. And those landscape tours, the lower landscape tour goes into the bowling alley. The upper landscape tour goes into the swimming pool building. We don't go into a lot of other buildings. Both of those buildings are very easily ventilated, and so that's why we feel safe going in. Our expectation right now, and I can't say specifically, but we are looking at Memorial Day possibly as a point at which we might be able to open. All of that is based on New York State regulations and what they identify. But we are hopeful at this point that at some point, if not earlier, either later in the summer or definitely by the fall, we believe we will be able to be open again for tours. One of the other things that you should be aware of at Lyndhurst is we also have huge numbers of activity. Spring and fall craft show, jazz on Thursday nights on the lawn in July and August, where we usually get 1,000 people a night. We have a flower show, which we won't be having this year because it's in April and we feel that's too early. The Westminster Kennel Club Best in Show Dog Show will be at Lyndhurst second weekend of June. We have extensive Halloween decorations in the fall. And then in wintertime, like most historic houses, extensive Christmas decorations, where we also have a market and have open house days. So there's a lot that you can visit in addition to taking tours, even if we don't have tours going on.
Thank you. That's great. Now, another question popped up. How much renovation is completed and what are your future plans?
I've been at Lyndhurst for about 8 years, and we've either renovated some or all of the building. So the mansion is largely renovated. They're, as all houses with that kind of crenellated roof, we have problems from time to time. But basically, when our backstairs tours open, you can go up 5 floors into the tower, see the panorama down to Manhattan, and then go all the way down to the basement to see the fully restored kitchens that are down there. So largely, you can pretty much see every part of the mansion except for the storage rooms and the back spaces. The laundry building, which is next to it, on our backstairs tour, the actual laundry is open. The upstairs, which has guest suites, is not usually open to the public unless you're coming to book a wedding. You can see it then. The bowling alley is fully restored and is open on certain tours, but is another building you can see almost completely from the outside because it's all windows. The carriage house complex is largely open, and where our visitor center is, not all the pieces are open. Some of our offices are in there, some is collection storage, but you can really see the main rooms and the horse stalls there. The swimming pool building is the one that is the last unrenovated building on the property, but we did a major refurbishment, so it's stable and watertight. And we have a contemporary art installation in that building right now, which should be opening again in May, which people will be able to see. The greenhouse services building is a behind the scenes space for our interns. And the greenhouse frame, I would say, is the last major unrestored project that we have. It's a very early cast iron, huge greenhouse frame by Lord & Burnham, the preeminent greenhouse makers in the United States. Their factory in Syracuse burns. Gould builds them a local factory, gets them down because 3 months after he buys the property, the wood greenhouse builds and it burns, and they build him a new greenhouse. So that'll take us a good 10 years, I would say, to redo. We're in the process of doing the final landscape renovations, and that we've got probably 6 to 10 more years on that. So some of the buildings to come, the Rose Cottage Children's Cottage is largely renovated, but we have to furnish it. In the lower landscape, we've done most of that, but we have Helen Gould's treehouse to rebuild, which we think will come in a year or two. Rose garden restoration will be a major thing. And really after that, it'll be just maintenance more than anything. So if you came today, you would not know that we have renovation to do. You'd think it's just a wonderful place to be.
So someone just posted, support the National Trust for Historic Preservation. So is that your biggest sponsor? Or
we are owned by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. We are one of their approximately 30 historic sites. And so we are the National Trust for Historic Preservation as a house. And you can support the National Trust directly. You can support it through supporting Lyndhurst. We're welcome for all ways. But again, this is the example of what the National Trust, it does a number of different things, but maintaining and restoring and supporting these houses that, quite frankly, at a certain point when heating was too expensive, taxes were too expensive, lifestyles changed. This place was a wreck when it came to the National Trust, and bit by bit, it's many years later. But as you can tell, we've still had a lot to do, and we're making our way through it. But that's why you have a National Trust, to keep houses like this going.
well, cheers to the National Trust and to Lyndhurst. One other question came up. Might you talk about triangle trading and slavery?
Yeah, so I'll give a little about what happened in New York, because a lot of people don't realize there was enslavement in the North. And in New York, I can't remember the exact dates. It's either I believe it's the early mid 1830s that it's finally outlawed. But when you think of the economic development of the United States, in many ways, the reason the South agriculturally became so rich is because through enslavement, they really had either free or close to free labor. And that's what allowed those Southern plantations, agricultural plantations, to be very wealthy. You didn't really have that as extensively in the North, although people did own slaves. So really where the money came, and it was true in New York, it was true in the big harbor towns. In New York, it's very true in Newport and Providence. The main families in those areas invested in shipping. And shipping was largely the triangle trade. You got goods from England. The ships went down. They started in England. They went down to Africa. They picked up enslaved people. They went across, oftentimes, to the Caribbean. They picked up goods there, increasingly things like lumber, mahogany, sugar, things like that. Came up to the East Coast of the United States, unloaded the enslaved at slave markets, sold the goods from England to the Americans who wanted them, the luxury goods, and then took the mahogany and the sugar back to England. And that's how the trade went. And if you owned those ships, it was a very profitable business for a very long time. Now, in New York, what people don't realize is, in addition to the Dutch families investing in the ships, the Livingston family, which is one of the most known families in New York, they were signers of the Declaration of Independence, actually were directly involved in the slave trade. And certain Livingstons actually owned slaves, were involved in catching fugitive slaves after it was outlawed in New York State. So they stayed in it. They married into major families in Charleston, South Carolina, which was another slave trading city, where there were also Livingstons. So people are unaware of this history in the North. It wasn't as extensive and pervasive as it was in the South, but it existed. And one of the things you have, especially in the Hudson Valley, is you have a deep African-American history of people with Dutch last names. So if you know the photographer, the Harlem Renaissance photographer, James Van der Zee, he comes from the Hudson Valley, has a Dutch last name because of that history.
Interesting. Thank you. Another popped up here. Thank you for arranging for this rich introduction to a wonderful estate. Look forward to visiting after the snow melts. Comforting to see our beloved history preserved and available for us to learn and enjoy. Well, thank you. That was very nice. If we have any other questions, I don't see any other questions, but this has been just amazing this evening. Wealth of knowledge and so entertaining. So I will lift my tea cup to the Gould family and thank you again, Howard Czar, for this evening. And we all look forward to come visiting, bowling, checking the gardens. So thank you again and have a good evening.
Thank you, and please all come visit.